In the quiet hours of the night, as the world slows and the mind begins to rest, we journey back to the early 19th century, to a Britain on the edge of transformation, and to a young girl destined to give her name to an entire era of history. This is the story of Queen Victoria, and the rise of the British Empire at its greatest height, a tale of power, progress, contradiction, and enduring legacy. Victoria was born on May 24, 1819, in Kensington Palace, London. At the time of her birth, she was not expected to become queen. She was fifth in line to the throne, a small and fragile child in a vast royal family. Yet fate, quiet and unrelenting, reshaped the future. One by one, those ahead of her died without legitimate heirs, and the young princess found herself standing at the center of Britain's destiny. Victoria's childhood was marked by isolation and strict control. Raised under the Kensington system, she was rarely allowed to be alone, even as she slept. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her advisor Sir John Conroy imposed rigid rules meant to keep the future queen dependent and obedient. This lonely upbringing shaped Victoria deeply, instilling both emotional vulnerability and an intense desire for independence. As dawn broke on June 20, 1837, the young princess was awakened early in the morning. Messengers had arrived with news that her uncle, King William IV, had died during the night. At just 18 years old, Victoria was now Queen of the United Kingdom. When she entered the council chamber later that day, small in stature yet composed in presence, observers were struck by her calm authority. The Victorian age had begun. Britain at the time was already a growing imperial power. Its navy ruled the seas, its factories hummed with the energy of the Industrial Revolution, and its influence stretched across continents. Yet the empire was also unstable, divided by class, strained by rapid urbanization, and shadowed by poverty and unrest. Victoria inherited not just a crown, but the responsibility of holding together a nation in rapid change. One of her first decisive acts was to distance herself from her mother's control. She moved into Buckingham Palace and began ruling independently, guided by her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. He became her political mentor, teaching her the workings of constitutional monarchy, a system where the monarch reigns but does not rule. This balance would define Victoria's long reign. In 1840, Victoria married her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Their marriage was not merely political, it was deeply affectionate. Albert became her closest advisor, shaping policy, culture, and moral values across the empire. Together, they promoted ideals of family, duty, and respectability, values that would come to define Victorian society. As Britain expanded its empire, the sun truly began to never set on British lands. From India to Africa, from the Caribbean to Australia, British rule extended across nearly a quarter of the globe. Railways, telegraphs, and steamships connected distant colonies to London, creating the world's first truly global empire. Yet this expansion came at a cost. Colonial rule often meant exploitation, cultural destruction, and violence. Indigenous populations were displaced, economies reshaped for British benefit, and resistance was frequently crushed. While Victorian Britain celebrated progress and civilization, the empire's darker realities unfolded far from the royal palaces. At home, the Industrial Revolution transformed daily life. Massive factories rose over cities like Manchester and Birmingham. Millions moved from rural villages into crowded urban centers. Wealth increased, but so did inequality. Child labor, dangerous working conditions, and widespread poverty sparked calls for reform. Throughout these changes, Queen Victoria became a symbol of stability. Though she wielded limited political power, her image carried immense influence. She embodied continuity in a world racing forward. Her long reign, over 63 years, allowed generations of citizens to know no other monarch. Tragedy struck in 1861 with the death of Prince Albert. Victoria was devastated. She withdrew from public life, dressing in black for the rest of her days. The empire continued to grow, but the queen herself retreated into mourning. Despite criticism, her symbolic power remained strong, and public affection eventually returned. By the late 19th century, Britain stood at the height of its imperial power. Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, reinforcing Britain's dominance over the subcontinent. Her image appeared on coins, stamps, and monuments across the world, a grandmotherly figure presiding over an empire vast beyond imagination. As the century drew toward its close, the world was changing again. New powers emerged. Old certainties began to fade. Yet Queen Victoria remained, a living link between past and future, tradition and transformation, and so, as night deepens and history gently unfolds, we pause here, at the beginning of an era that reshaped the modern world. The story of Queen Victoria and the British Empire is only just beginning. As Queen Victoria settled into her role as monarch, Britain itself continued its relentless transformation. The empire was no longer just a collection of distant territories, it had become a complex global system of trade, governance, and power. At the heart of this system stood London, the nerve center of finance, industry, and imperial administration, pulsing with energy both creative and destructive. The mid-19th century marked the full force of the Industrial Revolution. Steam power reshaped transportation, factories multiplied, and cities expanded at astonishing speed. Railways carved through the countryside, shrinking distances and accelerating commerce. For many, these changes brought opportunity and wealth. For others, they brought exhaustion, danger, and despair. Millions of workers labored long hours in factories filled with deafening machines and choking air. Children, some as young as 6, worked beside adults in mines and textile mills. Accidents were frequent, lives were short, and poverty was widespread. These conditions sparked growing public concern and the early movements for social reform. Parliament responded slowly. A series of factory acts attempted to limit working hours and improve safety, especially for women and children. Though imperfect, these laws marked an important shift, the recognition that industrial progress required moral responsibility. Queen Victoria, while cautious in public statements, supported reforms that aligned with stability and order. Beyond Britain's shores, the empire faced increasing resistance. In India, British rule had expanded rapidly through the East India Company, often ignoring local traditions and governance. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, fueled by economic exploitation, cultural disrespect, and military dominance. In 1857, these tensions erupted into the Indian Rebellion, often called the Indian Mutiny by the British. What began as a military uprising quickly spread across northern India, becoming a widespread challenge to British authority. The conflict was brutal on all sides, marked by violence, fear, and retaliation. The rebellion shocked Britain. News traveled slowly, but when it arrived, it deeply unsettled the public and the crown. In response, the British government dissolved the East India Company and placed India directly under crown rule. This moment fundamentally reshaped the empire, tightening control while promising reform. Though often failing to deliver true equality, Victoria took a personal interest in India. In 1876, she accepted the title of Empress of India, a symbolic act meant to reinforce unity and loyalty. Yet the realities of imperial rule remained deeply unequal. British officials governed from grand residences, while many Indians lived under harsh economic pressures and limited political voice. Back in Britain, the empire's wealth fueled cultural confidence. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace, showcased industrial achievements from across the world. Glass, steel, textiles, and machines dazzled visitors, presenting Britain as the leader of modern civilization. Prince Albert played a central role in organizing the exhibition, viewing it as a celebration of progress and peace. Yet even as technology advanced, society remained deeply divided by class. The Victorian ideal of respectability emphasized discipline, morality, and order, values promoted by the monarchy and middle class. At the same time, vast numbers of people lived in overcrowded housing with little access to education or healthcare. Writers and thinkers of the era captured these contradictions. Charles Dickens exposed the harsh realities of poverty and child labor. Social reformers pushed for public sanitation, education, and housing improvements. Slowly, Britain began to recognize that empire abroad could not compensate for suffering at home. Queen Victoria's personal life, once filled with warmth and companionship, grew increasingly somber after Prince Albert's death. She withdrew from public appearances, preferring the quiet of Windsor Castle and Balmoral in Scotland. Her absence sparked criticism, yet her image remained powerful, a grieving widow, human and distant, yet still central to the nation's identity. Despite her retreat, Victoria remained engaged through correspondence and state papers. She advised prime ministers, expressed strong opinions, and defended the monarchy's dignity. Figures such as Benjamin Disraeli skillfully balanced royal favor with parliamentary power, shaping policies that expanded empire while maintaining constitutional limits. As decades passed, the empire faced new challenges. Competition from other European powers intensified. Germany and the United States rose as industrial rivals. Imperial conflicts in Africa and Asia strained resources and tested moral justifications for expansion. Still, for many in Britain, the empire represented pride and security. Colonial troops, raw materials, and trade routes seemed to guarantee national strength. Maps colored in imperial red adorned classrooms and homes, reinforcing the idea of Britain's global destiny. By the late 19th century, Queen Victoria had become more than a ruler, she was a living symbol. Her jubilees drew massive crowds, celebrating not only her longevity but the endurance of the empire itself. Few questioned how long such dominance could last. As night settles deeper and thoughts grow quieter, we pause again in this unfolding story, at a moment when Britain stands tall, confident and commanding, unaware that the foundations of its empire are already beginning to shift. As the 19th century moved toward its final decades, the British Empire stood at what many believed was the peak of its power. Its territories spanned continents, its navy controlled the world's oceans, and its economic influence reached into nearly every corner of global trade. Yet beneath this appearance of unshakable dominance, subtle fractures were beginning to form. Imperial confidence was reinforced by military strength. The Royal Navy remained the largest and most technologically advanced in the world, guarding sea lanes and projecting British authority across vast distances. Advances in weaponry and communication allowed London to manage distant colonies with increasing efficiency, reinforcing the belief that the empire was both permanent and inevitable. Africa became a central focus of imperial ambition during this period. European powers rushed to claim territory in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Britain expanded its control from Egypt to South Africa, driven by strategic routes, natural resources, and national prestige. Railways, ports, and administrative centers were established rapidly, often with little regard for existing societies. These expansions were frequently justified in moral terms. British officials spoke of bringing civilization, law, and progress to distant lands. Missionaries accompanied soldiers and administrators, spreading Christianity and European values. Yet for many African communities, imperial rule meant loss of land, forced labor, and violent suppression of resistance. One of the most symbolic conflicts of the era occurred in southern Africa. The discovery of diamonds and gold intensified tensions between British authorities and the Boer republics. These tensions would eventually lead to the South African Wars, revealing both the empire's military power and its moral contradictions. While Britain emerged victorious, the human cost was immense. In Asia, the empire faced equally complex challenges. China resisted British commercial dominance, leading to conflicts such as the Opium Wars. These wars forced open Chinese ports to British trade and legalized opium imports, creating deep resentment. While Britain framed these actions as trade protection, the ethical consequences were widely criticized. Even at the time. India, the crown jewel of the empire, remained central to Britain's global position. Infrastructure expanded rapidly. Railways, canals, and telegraph lines connected vast regions. These developments improved administration and movement but were primarily designed to serve imperial interests. Indian industries were often undermined in favor of British manufacturing, reshaping local economies. Cultural control became a key imperial strategy. English education systems were introduced, training a small elite to administer colonial systems. While this created opportunities for some, it also alienated traditional structures and values. Over time, these educated elites would become leaders of resistance, using the language and ideas of the empire to challenge its authority. At home, Britain continued to project confidence and stability. Queen Victoria, now elderly, was widely revered. Her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and Diamond Jubilee in 1897 were grand celebrations of imperial unity. Troops and representatives from across the empire gathered in London, creating a powerful image of global allegiance. These celebrations, however, masked growing anxieties. Industrial rivals were catching up. Social reform remained incomplete. Labor movements demanded fair wages and political representation. Women began to organize more visibly, calling for suffrage and legal rights. The empire's image of order faced pressure from within. Victoria herself had become increasingly symbolic. She rarely intervened directly in policy, yet her presence offered reassurance. To many, she represented moral authority and continuity in an uncertain world. Her personal grief had softened her public image, transforming her into a figure of empathy rather than command. In the colonies, resistance movements grew more organized. In Ireland, demands for home rule intensified, challenging British control closer to home. In India, early nationalist organizations formed, advocating reform and self-governance. These movements were still limited, but their foundations were being laid. Technological progress continued to reshape life. Electricity, photography, and early motion pictures transformed communication and culture. Newspapers circulated imperial news daily, shaping public perception. Stories of distant lands fed both curiosity and fear, reinforcing imperial myths while hinting at instability. By the late 1890s, the empire faced a paradox. It had never been larger, yet it had never been more vulnerable. Expansion required constant resources, military presence, and political will. Each new territory brought new responsibilities and resistance. As Queen Victoria approached the end of her life, the world she ruled was changing faster than ever before. The certainties of the early Victorian age were fading. The 20th century loomed, bringing new ideologies, new powers, and new conflicts that the empire was not fully prepared to face. And so, as night deepens and thoughts drift softly, we pause once more, at the twilight of an age that believed in its own permanence, unaware that history was already preparing to turn the page. As the 19th century drew to a close, Queen Victoria had become an enduring presence in the lives of her subjects. For more than 6 decades, her image had watched over a rapidly changing world. Entire generations had grown up knowing no other monarch. Yet time, relentless and impartial, was approaching its final chapter in her long reign. Victoria's health gradually declined in her later years. Age weighed heavily upon her, and the accumulated grief of a lifetime, the loss of Prince Albert, children, and close companions, left her physically frail and emotionally withdrawn. Still, she continued her duties as best she could, receiving ministers, signing documents, and maintaining the dignity of the crown. The world around her was no longer the world of her youth. New technologies reshaped daily life at an unprecedented pace. Electric lights replaced gas lamps in city streets. Telegraph cables stretched beneath oceans, allowing messages to cross continents in moments. The empire, once managed by letters carried on ships, now operated at the speed of modern communication. In the colonies, the foundations of imperial authority were quietly shifting. Administrative systems had become more rigid, but they also exposed contradictions. British ideals of justice and governance often clashed with realities of inequality and exclusion. Educated elites in India, Africa, and other colonies increasingly questioned the legitimacy of foreign rule. At home, Britain faced rising social and political demands. Workers organized for better wages and safer conditions. The push for expanded voting rights continued. Women's suffrage movements gained strength, challenging long-held assumptions about gender and power. These changes signaled a society in transition. Even as it clung to imperial pride, Queen Victoria observed these developments from a distance. Though she remained personally conservative, she understood the importance of gradual change. Her long reign had taught her that survival depended on adaptation. The monarchy, she believed, must remain above political conflict while symbolizing national unity. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died peacefully at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. She was 81 years old. The news spread rapidly across the empire, carried by telegraph wires to the farthest colonies. A profound sense of loss followed. For many, her death marked the end of an era. Across Britain, streets fell silent. Shops closed. Black mourning cloth draped buildings and windows. Church bells tolled in cities and villages alike. From London to Bombay, from Cape Town to Sydney, ceremonies were held in her memory. The empire paused, united in grief. Victoria's funeral was unlike any before it. She had requested a military ceremony, reflecting both her role as sovereign and her connection to the armed forces. The procession through London drew massive crowds, standing quietly as her coffin passed. The age of Victoria officially came to an end. Her son, Edward VII, ascended the throne, ushering in a new era. The Edwardian age promised optimism, elegance, and social change. Yet beneath the surface, the world faced mounting tensions. International rivalries intensified. Alliances formed. The balance of power shifted uneasily. Without Victoria's steady presence, the empire felt subtly different. The moral authority she embodied could not be inherited. While Britain remained powerful, it now faced a century of challenges that would test its global position. The certainty of empire began to fade. In the colonies, nationalist movements grew more confident. The ideas planted during the Victorian era, education, political organization, and legal rights, now turned against imperial rule. Leaders emerged who envisioned self-governance and independence, inspired partly by the values Britain itself had promoted. Technological progress accelerated into the 20th century. Automobiles replaced horse-drawn carriages. Early airplanes took to the skies. Communication became faster, and the world felt smaller than ever before. Yet this speed also magnified conflict, making future wars more devastating. Looking back, Queen Victoria's reign stands as one of the most influential periods in modern history. It was an age of invention and empire, order and exploitation, confidence and contradiction. Her legacy cannot be reduced to triumph or failure alone. It is a reflection of humanity's capacity for both progress and harm. As night settles gently and the mind drifts toward rest, we reflect on this remarkable chapter of history. The story of Queen Victoria and the British Empire is not merely a tale of power, but a reminder that all empires, like all lives, are shaped by time, change, and the quiet turning of history's wheel. With the passing of Queen Victoria, the world stepped quietly into a new century. The empire she had symbolized for more than 60 years continued to exist, but it no longer carried the same sense of permanence. The 20th century arrived with promise and uncertainty intertwined, and the British Empire would soon discover that even the largest powers are shaped and limited by time. Under King Edward VII, Britain embraced a brief era of confidence and refinement. The Edwardian age brought social elegance, artistic expression, and a sense of relief after decades of strict Victorian morality. Yet beneath the polished surface, the foundations of empire were beginning to shift in ways that could not be easily reversed. Industrial rivals such as Germany and the United States surpassed Britain in manufacturing and innovation. Global competition intensified. Naval arms races and diplomatic tensions signaled a world moving toward conflict. The empire, vast and complex, required constant maintenance, militarily, economically, and politically. In the colonies, nationalist movements grew stronger and more organized. In India, political organizations expanded their demands from reform to self-rule. In Ireland, long-standing tensions moved toward open struggle. Across Africa and Asia, resistance took many forms, cultural, political, and sometimes armed, challenging the assumption that imperial authority was natural or eternal. The First World War would soon place unbearable strain on the empire. Millions of colonial soldiers fought in distant lands, defending an imperial system that denied them equal rights. The war weakened Britain economically and psychologically, exposing the cost of global dominance. Though the empire emerged victorious, it was forever changed. In the years that followed, the process of imperial decline accelerated. Economic hardship, political unrest, and the rise of new global powers made it increasingly difficult to maintain control. The Second World War further exhausted Britain's resources, pushing the empire toward inevitable transformation. One by one, colonies moved toward independence. India and Pakistan in 1947 marked a turning point, signaling the end of Britain's role as a dominant imperial power. Other nations soon followed, reshaping the global map. What remained was not an empire, but a commonwealth, a loose association built on cooperation rather than control. Looking back, the Victorian era stands as a defining chapter in human history. It was an age of extraordinary innovation. Railways, medicine, communication, and industry transformed the world. At the same time, it was an age of inequality, exploitation, and cultural domination. Both realities exist side by side, inseparable and enduring. Queen Victoria herself remains a symbol of these contradictions. She ruled during a time of immense growth and suffering, order and injustice. Her long life bridged the old world and the modern age, connecting monarchy with industrial society, tradition with transformation. Today, the legacy of the British Empire is still felt across the globe, in language, law, infrastructure, and culture. Former colonies continue to grapple with the consequences of imperial rule, while also shaping independent futures. History does not fade, it echoes. As we reflect quietly, we are reminded that empires rise not only through power, but through belief in destiny, superiority, and permanence. And they fall when those beliefs no longer hold. The story of the British Empire is not merely British history, it is global history, shared by millions across continents. And so, as this journey comes gently to an end, we return to the stillness of the present moment. The long arc of history continues beyond kings and queens, beyond borders and empires. It moves softly, shaping the world as night shapes the day, not with noise, but with time. Let the story of Queen Victoria and the British Empire drift into memory now, like a distant echo. History rests, and so may you.